remember, you can follow us on Investment 360, that hashtag Investment 360 on Twitter. Well, first up, Geopolitics is the study of the effects of geography, both human and physical, on international politics and international relations. Now, the emergence of the geopolitical model as a tangible indicator of market opportunities and threats has gained considerable interest industry-wide. Now, the question, therefore, is how this model impacts institutional and private investor portfolios right now. So we've got David Murren, CEO of Mergent Asset Management and author of the book Breaking the Code of History, joining us from Cape Town to tell us more about this. David, thanks for joining us today. So, I mean, your book also focusing in on Africa right now and the impact that geopolitics will play on investors' portfolios. But I suppose you could give us a quick synopsis in terms of the underlying thesis that you presented in the book.
Look, essentially, trying to understand how systems rise and fall is very relevant to how you invest and where you invest, and just our understanding of our world today and giving history context. And so I outlined a 5 stages model I chose empires because they're on average about 500 years long, maybe 400 years, and they have 5 distinct stages. And the first one is regionalization, where essentially the entity comes together. It has a civil war at the end of regionalization that defines the very nature of the values and way it will go out into the world. It then expands in ascension to empire. Having trading routes, it looks to militarize those routes, and it actually takes over land and territory of other countries to build a bigger system. It then reaches maturity, and all through those 3 stages, expansive demographics power that expansion. And then it moves into overextension, where it really can't afford itself. It may pretend otherwise. And then it moves into decline, where it's unable to defend its system. And those 5 stages, I found, repeated across every empire cycle I could find in history. And once I understood how those empire cycles worked, you really could compare a banana in history to a banana. And history fails for me because most people don't understand the general context. And once I was able to define the past, I could start to understand the present. And the first thing I understood was the Western Christian Empire wasn't about nations. It was a sequence of Christian systems bonded by a religious idea and value. It started with the Portuguese, it went to the Spanish, then the Dutch, and then the French tried and failed ultimately against the British. The British built the biggest system within that Western Christian Empire. And then we had a sequence of destructive wars. And the last of the Western Christian empires is America. And America is in itself in decline. That whole system is changing, and rising in the East is a system which has been building for 100 years, which is an Asian super empire led by China that really is in a very advanced form of ascension to empire. And then if you look at Africa, it's in an early regionalizational phase, and then you look at the impact of the 2 exterior forces, and you start to really understand how Africa could be impacted by its own growth and the events outside its borders.
So Africa essentially is in phase 1 and the US is in phase 5 right now. Talk to us about that dynamic as it's playing out, given the fact that we saw Obama recently coming to the continent, pledging to commit some money to infrastructure, and it did seem like there was more of a focus on what the African continent could mean to the United States. But your thoughts on the dynamics playing out there?
Well, look, Africa was, and South Africa was particularly important in the Cold War because the trade routes around the Cape represented very important strategic sea lanes for NATO. And in fact, when the Cold War collapsed, so did apartheid. And no one really ever talks about the external influences of how that process took place. But since then, Africa's been the vacuous space of American foreign policy. And that was the space that China chose and has chosen to move into because America's had really no policy of how to support the growth of nations, give them the right financial constraints and offerings, and help them move forwards. And that's really been one of the great weaknesses, which has allowed China to do the very opposite, seeking resources and seeking a place to expand into. China has been incredibly prevalent on the continent. We can talk about that in a minute. I think Obama's whole visit may appear to be a change in policy, but like all of his foreign policies, they're really paper tigers. They have no substance or no commitment behind them. So although it might have been a great bit of PR, the reality is that countries seeking investment are not receiving new and different terms from America that compete with Chinese investment, and that really doesn't help the dynamics on the continent.
and it's those terms of commitments, which is certainly interesting if you look at some of the loans that Chinese governments have given African governments and the type of investments they're making, and almost the nature of investments certainly is a shift from what we've seen from the United States. But give us your view on then the relationship that stands between Africa and the East right now. Of course, China I'm talking about predominantly here.
Well, I mean, China really, I think, as far back as the early 90s, saw Africa as a vacuous space in American foreign policy that it could move into and resource itself, recognizing it would have to import vast resources for its industrialized society. And it's been doing it ever since, and it against very little resistance. And the terms of its loans and its infrastructural creation may appear to be wonderful gifts from the outside to nations that have accepted them. But I think if you go back and look at colonialism that Europe espoused, you would move in economically, you would build businesses and infrastructure, and then if they were ever threatened, the next step was you protected them with your soldiers that never left. And I think that one of the real threats that Africa faces, if this progression isn't stopped by a more conscious African response and slightly different terms are given by the Chinese, is that Africa is mortgaging its future to the Chinese. And as they go and militarize and ultimately go and start to compete with the Americans, they will easily be capable of projecting power into Africa in a few years' time.
Let's talk about internal geopolitics, if you could call it that, because there's certainly been a rise of terrorism across the continent. Nigeria has been affected by it. Investments in Nigeria have been affected by it. Certainly companies that have been operating there, we've seen it impacting earnings. That, of course, is just one snapshot. We saw that gas facility being attacked in Algeria. But from your perspective right now, point out the main geopolitical risks as you see them on the African continent.
Well, let's go back and use the 5 stages of empire to describe where Africa is. It's in a middle regionalization phase, and it started to bifurcate north and south, just below the Sub-Saharan belt. And to the north, you have the Islamic world, and to the south, you have the Christian tribal world. And along those borders, you have less resources with things like climate change, and you have basically conflict zones erupting because population densities can't be supported by the resources available. And what you described in Algeria and Nigeria is actually a manifestation of North Africa and the Islamic world, which is in itself in very late regionalization. All of these civil wars you see in Libya and Egypt and Syria are part of the regional civil war at the end of the Islamic Middle East's evolution. And it's going to go on for a long time, and that whole dynamic is about who leads with which values, and it will keep filtering through various parties, various options, until one entity is dominant across the Middle East, in my opinion. And so that whole band is conflict ridden. And if you're an investor going into North Africa, you need to pick your destination very carefully and understand, maybe the isolated pockets that are safe. But that leaves Sub-Saharan Africa as, I think, a very safe destination as long as you're far enough south and away from that belt of conflict. So in terms of that aspect there, it certainly has been seen in the last few days with the crisis in Syria as it's panning out and potentially a military response. We've seen asset classes respond to that, gold, of course, oil coming to mind. But when it comes to Sub-Saharan Africa, what are your thoughts then on how institutional investors should look at the emergence of these economies right now, the modernization of these economies, and then choose investments based on where they are in the stage of their development? Well, look, the first thing is that this 5-stage model is driven by demographics, and Sub-Saharan demographics are incredibly powerful. And that's a really good thing. It's the first tick box as an investor I look at because it represents a rising tide. So then you've got to look at how each of the individual countries within that region and where they are in their own economic cycle and which business areas they need to develop and grow with. And then you look at their whole resourcing policy, how they sell resources or develop resources. Look at their rule of law. Obviously South Africa is in a different phase than Mozambique or Zambia or Zimbabwe. So each of them have particular subsets you've got to really understand. But as a broad-based area, I think Sub-Sahara is very interesting. If you want to go to the DRC, then security is really important in terms of where you go. Each of them have a various caveat, but as a region, I think there's a huge opportunity in the Sub-Saharan zone.
Where does South Africa then fit into the 5 stages of development right now? And I suppose we are, looking towards the elections next year, 6 democratic elections in South Africa. We're certainly seeing the volatility, the unrest that's been reflected in labour negotiations and labour strife in South Africa. But where's South Africa right now, according to you, David?
Your driver asked me the same question when we drove over here. So look, if you take this 5 stages model, it works for empires, it works for nations, it works for companies. So let's just move it down to South Africa and its whole process. That your civil war completed itself, and the result was the end of apartheid and a new regime balance. And since that, you're building a black middle class, which is always a great form of stability and a buffer between people who rule and everyone else. One of the biggest problems for South Africa is its borders are porous. So every time it is successful, people migrate south and puts increased pressure on the nation. So I think you've got to do something about your borders so then you can start to fix problems internally. You've been through your civil war and you're not going back, as far as I'm concerned, because I can't find cases in history where once that's happened definitively, it starts again. So when people talk about the unrest and is it going to get worse, it's there because the changes haven't been fast enough promised to the people who supported the change back in the 90s.
Yeah.
That being said, I think you also need a different type of leadership. I would define leadership in its true form, and certainly in the growthful forms of empire, as service. And unless a leader serves its people rather than himself or herself, he's not or she's not leading. And in many ways, you need to define your expectation of what is good and bad leadership. With good leadership, I think South Africa has the most enormous potential. With poor leadership, you delay the outcome of growth, but you are really going through indigestion, restructuring, and I'm enormously positive for South Africa over the next 10 years because I do believe you'll be successful, although it might feel traumatic along the way.
It certainly does feel traumatic, but optimism there is always welcome, David. David, just a quick one. So just to sum this up, I mean, you're talking about the empire of Sub-Saharan Africa really now being in ascension. Does this mean you're positive on it for investors when it comes to getting exposure to this through either the fixed income markets or through equities?
Look, I think the whole Sub-Saharan region, look, it's not going to build an empire, but it's certainly going through the stages that lead to that growthful dynamic. There are a lot of other systems that are far more in advance, and the world isn't big enough for multiple empires anymore. But I do think as an investment zone, there's huge opportunity. I think it's far better than Latin America, certainly in Asia where there are other challenges. And so whether you buy, you've got to be careful about the timing of everything you buy, whether it's bonds or equity. But generically, do I think this is a multi-decade growthful environment? Absolutely. And I think Africa is probably the premier destination for investment that I can think of globally.
David, thanks for joining us today. Appreciate your time. David Murren, CEO of Mergent Asset Management.